Hey guys, welcome back to Fantasy Tip. My name is Julian, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about the Tampa Bay Lightning, continuing our series of episodes, talking about each NHL team, talking about the lines that I'm projecting for this year, and then talking about their noteworthy players and whether I think you should consider drafting those players. And because training camps and preseason has started, we're actually able to look at what the Lightning lines have actually looked like so far. And on the top line, they've got Stamkos, Point, and Kucherov combining their three best players on a line. That's bound to be a deadly line. Killorn, Paul, and Hagel is the second line. And on the third line, they have Fortier, Namestnikov, and Ross Colton. Jumping into the noteworthy players now, and first on the list is Andrei Vasilevskiy. And he had himself a nice season last year with 39 wins, 63 games started, and he's been the highest goalie drafted for so many years now in fantasy. He's just a first-round pick every single year because the Lightning are always a good team, and he's always a very, very solid goaltender, and he always gets a lot of the starts for Tampa Bay because Brian Elliott, their backup, is actually a pretty good backup, but he only gets the back-to-back games. Now, Andrei Vasilevskiy, the reason I don't have him as an absolute must-draft, like great option to pick, because he's going in the first round, right? And I don't personally think that drafting a goaltender in the first round is a great strategy, unless your league is super favoring goalies, in which case, go for it. But drafting a goalie in the first round of your draft is not always the best recipe for success, because if you're grabbing a goalie, you're missing out on one of the elite forwards or defensemen that you could be getting in that round. And then you'll just be lacking on the forward depth the rest of the season. Whereas goalies, you can get someone who's almost as good, like a UC Saros or Jacob Markstrom, a few rounds later, and that's going to be a lot more effective strategy than grabbing Vasilevskiy or Shesterkin in the first round of your draft. Next up, Nikita Kucherov, who had 69 points in 47 games last year, is currently being drafted at an ADP of 9.4. Last year, he finished as the 9th best fantasy player in terms of fantasy points per game. Obviously, he missed almost half the season, but this year, if he can stay healthy, I think he's a very good value pick at this ADP. I think he can be a top 6 or 7 player this year quite easily, and that's why I like him at this ADP. It's good value here. Next, I have Victor Hedman, who last year was over a point per game, had a career best season with 85 points in 82 games. It was absolutely fantastic. Had a nice amount of block shots and shots on goal as well, which gave him a nice floor. I'm expecting another very solid year from Hedman this year. He's going to continue to man that top power play in Tampa Bay with Kucherov, with Stamkos. It's going to be a solid year for him. And if he can continue like he did last year, wow, is he ever going to be some solid value in your draft? This ADP of 14.5, he's a little high. I do have him as the 26th best fantasy player this year. But if you do want to lock up one of the best defensemen in all of fantasy, that might be the price you have to pay for him. Next, I have Steven Stamkos, who last year had an amazing year, scoring 106 points, 42 goals, and almost a full season with 81 games. Now, that shooting percentage might look a little high at 17.4%, but Stamkos has consistently shot his whole career around 17%, so I'm not too worried about that going down. And this year, he's right now lined up with both Kucherov and with Brayden Point. And remember, guys, last year Stamkos did not have Kucherov for the majority of the season. He did play with him on the power play once Kucherov did come back, but Kucherov was injured half the year for one. And then when he was back, they didn't really play together for the most part. So Stamkos is really good in his own right and doesn't need other star players around him to perform. I definitely do like Stamkos this year. He's a little bit inconsistent from year to year. He'll have one amazing year and have one less good year, but still good year the year after. But I'm expecting Stamkos to have a solid year anyway this year. And then I have Brayden Point, who last year had 58 points in 66 games, ended up as the 73rd best fantasy player overall, and is currently being drafted at an ADP of 117.2. So by that regards, obviously, he's being drafted significantly later than how he finished last year, which is really good. And he is pretty good value there, and I do think his shooting percentage will go up even a little bit next year because he's averaged a 17.1 shooting percentage his career, and last year he was a little bit lower than that at 15.9. Now, Brayden Point is going to be playing, it looks like, with both Kucherov and Stamkos, which can only help his value if he's playing the whole year with Kucherov and the whole year with Stamkos. I think he's a pretty good value at where he's currently going in drafts, even though he is a natural center, so which is why he's going that late. But if you can wait till Brayden Point's range to grab him, he's definitely not a bad pick at all where he's currently being drafted. Then we have Mikhail Sergachev, who last year finished as the 180th best fantasy player in terms of fantasy points per game. He's a safe pick, but he's a boring pick. He's someone who will get around 40-ish points on the season every single year, but he's never going to do a whole lot better than that. He's the guy who would take that top power play spot if Victor Hedman got injured. Last year, though, Victor Hedman played the full 82 games. He's someone that generally is good at staying healthy. So Sergachev, well, he's going to put up some decent peripherals and put up an okay amount of points. Going to be a very, very safe pick for you. Definitely not someone that has a whole lot of upside. Then we have Alex Killorn, who is a left wing and right wing, which is definitely great. And he's being drafted in 31% of leagues at an ADP of 169.7. Now, last year he finished as the 155th best fantasy player in terms of fantasy points per game. So his ADP, in theory, compared to where he finished last year, is pretty much right where he ended up finishing. Also, though, his shooting percentage is going to come down a little bit. He's averaged 12% in his career, and last year shot at 15.2%. So he's going to get a few less goals this year. And also, the way they're lining up right now, Killorn's playing with Paul and with Hagel, not with any of the studs, Point, Stamkos, or Kucherov. So that's not going to help him, although he should get that top power play time with those studs. So I don't think Killorn's going to have a particularly bad year. I'm not overly high on him this year, though, especially since he's not lined up with those guys, and that shooting percentage is going to come down. So he's going to have an okay year and definitely should be drafted in deeper leagues, but he's not someone I'm super high on drafting myself. Then I have Anthony Cirelli, who had shoulder surgery in July, and he's going to be out until mid-November at the very earliest. So I'm not expecting him back until November 15th, absolute earliest. And honestly, guys, he's not someone who's that great in fantasy anyway. So personally, I'm not going to be drafting him unless for some reason I'm in a league with a ridiculous amount of IR spots, in which case you might as well pick him up after your draft, throw him on an IR spot. But honestly, guys, not someone I'm crazy about this year. Then I have Colton, who had a surprisingly good season last year, had 39 points in 79 games, so it's basically a point every 2 games, and he hits a good amount as well, so it gives us a little bit of a safe floor there. So Colton, while he is currently lined up on the 3rd line, that's where he was last year as well, and he was able to put up these kind of stats. So if you are in a bangers league or a deep league that has hits as a category, Colton, well, he's not someone that I absolutely love. He's someone that is a safe pick if you're desperate at the end of a draft. He ended up as the 190th best player last year in terms of fantasy points per game, and his on-ice shooting percentage was quite low at only 8.7, so his point production should actually get a little bit higher. And that's why I don't hate him this year. Next is Erik Cernak, who scored only 13 points in 55 games. But if you're drafting Erik Cernak, it's not for the point production, it's for the hits. And he hits a pretty decent amount, about 3 times per game on average. That's pretty freaking good. Last year ended up finishing as the 255th best fantasy player in terms of fantasy points per game in leagues that count hits. He's not someone that I'm super high on, obviously, but if you are desperate and you need a defenseman super late in the draft and you are in a league that counts hits or a bangers league, he's someone that you can consider as your last defenseman. And then I have Nick Paul, who's someone that I actually really like this year, ended up with 32 points in 80 games, which doesn't look like anything too special. Now, the big thing is after he was traded from Ottawa to Tampa Bay, he performed really, really well. Had 14 points in 21 games, and at the pace that he was on, he would have finished as the 139th best player on this season had he continued that pace, obviously, for an entire season. Now, that's pretty good. Obviously, his shooting percentage was a little bit high. That's not something that he's going to be able to maintain. But right now, it's looking like he's slotted in for a second-line role alongside Killorn and Hagel, which is pretty solid. And last year, in an elevated role, like I just mentioned, he did very, very well. So he's someone that might make for a really good late-round sneaky pick, because Nick Paul could definitely be a top 150, top 200 player for sure. And if you're in a super deep league and you need someone who has that upside, Nick Paul is that guy. And finally, we have Brandon Hagel, who's both left wing and right wing, which is nice. Ended up with 44 points in 77 games last year, which is actually pretty good. But unlike Nick Paul, kind of the opposite happened once he was traded from Chicago to Tampa Bay. His production kind of really dropped off and didn't really do a whole lot offensively, so it's not something that you really like for fantasy. This year, though, at least right now, looks like he's projected to start on the second line with Nick Paul and with Killorn, which is really, really good. I'm not drafting him as of yet, though, but if he can figure it out, he could be a solid player down the line in deeper leagues. And that's it, guys. Thank you so much for watching all the way through. Please leave a like, hit the subscribe button, hit that notification bell, and if you do want to take your support to the next level, the link to my Patreon is down in the description below. Thanks so much, guys, and I'll catch you in the next episode of Fantasy Tipped.